Craig, thank you very much for this beneficial information that you've bestowed upon us. Questions from the committee? Senator Sosnowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Craig, for being here today and giving us a presentation. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
I just have a few questions now, but and that would be great if you could furnish the chair and the members of the commission with the study that you last referred to, called Fuel.
Yep.
I think that would be very interesting. That was one of my questions. I wanted to know more about that, but if we have the study, we can do that. So as far as the facilities that you talked about in about the middle of the presentation in Indiana.
Yep.
You mentioned that one. Now, are there other facilities operating in the United States that are similar to that?
Yep. So Agilex, which I mentioned, has a facility in Tigard, Oregon. It's actually called Regenix now because they're in a joint venture with America's Styrenics. So they have changed that facility a little bit. So what they do, their feedstock now is only polystyrene. And so, as I mentioned, sort of your think of your foam, your Solo cups, things like that, your coffee lids. So they take polystyrene. Polystyrene is used a lot in agriculture as well, for flower pots and things like that. And they take that polystyrene and they break it back down to styrene monomer. And then America's Styrenics is taking that as the offtake and then making brand new polystyrene again. So that's a good example. Renewlogy is a company that's based in Salt Lake City. They have a facility there. They've been taking what's called energy bag material from a couple cities like Omaha and Boise. So where they collect flexible films curbside in special bags and are bringing them there. Renewlogy actually also has been awarded a contract with the city of Phoenix to process their 3 through 7 bales. So we'll hope to see that under construction soon. Nexus Fuels, as I mentioned, is operating in Georgia. And they've undergone an expansion. They have offtake from Shell. So yes, Fulcrum Bioenergy that I mentioned, they're building a facility outside of in Nevada, and that's where they're going to be making their sort of jet fuel for United. So there's a few more. There's actually a lot more, and we can provide you with a map of those facilities as well if you'd like.
That would be good.
Yeah.
I guess. Along with the map, I mean, you've given us an idea of the one in Ashley, Indiana. How many tons of post-use plastics will be used? 100,000 tons, which is a lot. And I'm trying to figure out in Rhode Island, we have, I think you said the figure was, I don't know if you had the exact figure. I think it was 26. Anyway, 2,000. I'm trying to, maybe I'm comparing oranges to apples or whatever. Obviously, this
2,000 is what you currently recycle now.
What we recycle. And
Yeah.
I think in your printout here, you talked about recoverable plastics. Now, does that mean that I know there are some plastics that aren't getting recycled now and they're going into the landfill. Does recoverable plastics mean those, like the big plastic toys and things like that, or are we just talking about the conventional recyclable materials?
When we talk about recoverable plastics, we're basically, what you wouldn't want to do with these facilities, and as Joe knows, doesn't make economic sense, is you're not going to compete. Number one, taking your water or soda bottles do not make actually good feed. Don't yield actually pretty well into fuel, and these have really good markets. So it wouldn't make sense to go and pay for this to then go and turn it into something that's worth less value. Same thing with polyethylene, your milk jugs and your detergent bottles. Those actually have good markets. So if people just got more of those into the bin, then those would go to
recycling.
Those would have markets as well. What we're talking about is there's a ton of plastics now, whether it's in the commercial space, think agricultural film and other sort of agricultural plastics. I brought some examples today. Shakeology, I've been trying to eat well since Christmas. I like to do this on my travels. Here's a coffee lid from my Dunkin' Donuts coffee this morning. Here's the snack that they gave me on the plane. Haven't eaten it yet. I got hungry, a little bit of beef jerky. So this type of plastics, all these films and flexibles, multi-layer plastics, some rigids, small plastics, all of them right now are having a really hard time getting recycled. And so these are the technologies. These technologies can take mixed plastics and turn them back into those basic chemical components.
So in other words, anything that doesn't have a market that is being recycled now.
Right.
Focusing on that, all those other
Yes.
things, and you mentioned agricultural films.
Yeah, the goal here is not to cannibalize existing markets,
No,
but to grow them.
I'm just
yeah.
what I'm trying to get a handle on is how much material and where is it going to come from to make this feasible.
Yeah.
I'll just say it that way, because I understand out in the Midwest they have lots of agricultural
Yep.
plastics and all that, and I just don't know if we have that amount in Rhode Island, if it would be feasible, or if we would have to bring in feedstock from the regional area. And then I know I'm asking too many questions in one. What would that entail as far as stockpiling the material, traveling the material, holding the material? I know it's a big issue because in Indiana, in Georgia, Utah, Nevada, they got a lot of room
Yep.
out there,
Yep.
and there's a lot of people in the cities, and there's a lot of agricultural production out there. I'm just trying to envision where this is all going to be coming from for Rhode Island to make it feasible. I don't know if you can answer that. I don't know if there's maybe. Resource Recovery knows how much material there is out there. Obviously, you know how much they're burying versus recycling. I'm just trying to get a handle on how much are we going to need to make this worthwhile,
Right.
and where is it going to come from?
Yeah. I mean, it would come from a variety of generators, right? So there's your households that are using a lot of plastic. Think about it, and again, it kills us because we want to get this recovered, but think about making dinner every single night. And except for the most part, your bottles and containers, your frozen pea bag, your bag with lettuce in it, maybe the cut up vegetables that you have, a lot of that stuff, the cheese packaging, is not getting recycled right now. So there's the home generator. Then there's sort of commercial generators, again, ag, the shipping industry. So you think about what's going on behind the scenes at Best Buy or at Walmart. They generate a ton of film in shipping plastics. Film markets are very challenged right now. Trex is really the one major buyer of film in this country. Trex makes decking. So there's a ton of behind the store. If you go down to that Nexus Fuels facility that I mentioned, they get a ton of film from malls and from supermarkets and from companies like Coach and others that use a lot of film to ship. And then, of course, there's industrial generators. So I think at a later hearing, you're going to hear from Tory Plastics, and they're going to talk about some of the plastics that they generate. So there's not going to be any one single source. It's going to come from residential, commercial, and industrial.
Okay.
And in our
I'll let
economics,
other people ask more questions. This is just a fascinating issue for me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. When I introduced this piece of legislation last year, I was inundated with emails regarding incineration. Is pyrolysis, is that incineration?
No.
What is the difference between incineration and pyrolysis system?
So incineration would be sort of waste energy, right? So in Massachusetts, I'm trying to think how many facilities they have. They have 4 or 5 facilities there, places like Wareham and Haverhill and Millbury, where they take garbage. This is mixed garbage. It's not source separated like the plastics that would be received at these facilities. And they burn it. And that's combustion. And that produces steam, and that steam can be used sometimes, but mainly it is sort of a steam that's used to produce electricity. So that's incineration. Here, again, there's no combustion of the plastics. The plastics are put in a vessel. They're heated until they melt, continue heat them until they turn into gas vapors, and then you cool and condense them, and then you have those liquids left over. So if you were combusting something, you wouldn't have those liquids at the end and then sell as a product. So this is not incineration.
Thank you. Terry, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Craig, thanks for coming today. Just a couple of questions. I'd like to follow up a little bit on Senator Sosnowski's questions. And that's looking upstream at where the fuel would come from to power a facility like that. Most of that stuff on the table there right now that you highlighted
Yep.
is mixed in with all the rest of the solid waste that's generated in Rhode Island.
Yep.
So that comes in, it's very dirty, it's not easy to segregate.
Yep.
What kind of upstream processing needs to be done to harvest that out of the rest of the garbage and feed it to a facility like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you know, I mean, we've been studying this because as part of our goal to reuse, recycle, and recover 100% by 2040, there is many different levers that have to be pulled, right? There needs to be sort of better education, there needs to be better collection, and there needs to be better sortation of plastics. And so a couple strategies that are out there right now that you've probably heard about is one is sort of the Hefty Energy bag. So this is Dow Chemical, and what they've told folks is everything that isn't asked for in your community recycling program, so whether it's a lid or these pouches or whatever, put those in a bag, and those bags then ride along with the recycling, and they're doing this in Omaha and Boise right now, and they pull those bags out at the materials recovery facility, and then they fast track them to Renewalogy to be turned into diesel fuel. So that's one solution, right? I mean, we still have to do more work on it and prove it out, and other members of ACC are looking at this as well. Another solution is in Pennsylvania, there's a project that a lot of different brands, including like Nestle, Purina, and Procter & Gamble, Target, and others have been working on. It's called Materials Recovery for the Future. And so as you all know, Joe knows pretty well, is if this gets into your bin, what does it do? It acts like paper, right? Because it's two-dimensional. So it ends up going in the paper stream, contaminating the paper, and bringing down the value of that. And so, usually these are not asked for in anybody's community recycling program. However, this Materials Recovery for the Future program is looking at if you put this in a bin, you can actually sort it out, and they've produced what's called an Arflex bale. And we can send you more information on this project. There's a whole website dedicated to it. And that Arflex bale makes a great material for pyrolysis to a fuel. Now, I will make the point that these are programs that are just at their infancy. This is not well scaled. However, what we need to do is really, there's no point in collecting this and sorting for it if there isn't an end market to sell it to, right? So the key thing is for our industry is really establishing the demand pull that's going to make the collection of this and the sortation worthwhile. So that's one way you would get
Just
those.
as a follow-up, who
Yeah.
does that upstream sort of supply chain work? Is it the facility? Does the facility work with the municipality or the government? Ultimately, it's going to involve change of behavior on a bunch of different customers.
It is.
So
It's going
how
to
does
take
that
it's going to
pull
take
together?
investment. There's no question, and I think those are kind of discussions that are going on with brand owners and others right now. And resin manufacturers, converters, that make the packaging. Is we all recognize that pretty much every major brand has committed that by 2025, 100% of their packaging is going to be recyclable. So we need to kind of fast track these programs. They've also committed that by 2025, percentages ranging from 25 to 50% of their packaging will include recycled content. So first we have to kind of prove out that these programs are technically feasible, and then now kind of figure out, okay, how do we scale and grow them? So there's been a lot of work behind the scenes of asking that question and thinking about it. But again, sort of all the pieces have to be in place. Like we can collect this and produce an Arflex bale through a bunch of MRFs, but we definitely need the offtake to be able to turn it into something.
Just as a follow-up, I was interested in the two slides you had on the economics. Do you have any background material on that? I'm just curious on that.
So we have our economics department. We had released a kind of a study on that. So I can send that to you, or just link to our website on it. And then what they do is based on that, and then sort of again using the data that was produced by Columbia University. That's how they kind of extrapolate the state numbers. So there's some individual. I can send you the individual report in which those numbers were based on as well.
And then the only other follow-up question I had is, overall, how would you characterize how efficient are these systems? So you get 100 tons of feedstock that goes in. You get how many how many tons of usable product that come out, and what happens to the other piece?
Yeah, give or take a few percentage points. So for pyrolysis, you're talking about an 80-10-10 process.
Okay.
So about 80%, 70, depending on how the feedstock is, right? If it's all polyethylene film, you're going to be pretty good. If it's got a little bit of PET mixed in and some other things, maybe a little bit lower. But somewhere between 75 to 80% are going to yield your saleable hydrocarbons. Another 10% or so is going to be kind of a char, and that char is maybe some of the pigments and a little bit of food contact or whatever's on the that's part of the plastics. And then finally, you're going to get 10% that are non-condensable gases, and those non-condensable gases are kind of like a propane, and so that's really where. So for the argon analysis, that's actually critical because the non-condensable gases are what are used as the process energy, and so that's why you don't need virgin natural gas to power the system. We also did, just as another report kind of along that, we did some work with the Earth Engineering Center of the City College of New York, and they looked at gasification of plastics. A very similar thing about sort of how plastics make the process much more efficient. You yield more methanol when you increase the percentages of plastics vis-a-vis the biomass and the feedstock.
Okay, thank you.
So I'd be happy to provide you with that report as well.
Thank you, Craig, for the presentation. Just a couple of questions. What is the typical timeline for these type of facilities from an application to an operational stage? Is it a 2, 3, 4 year from start to finish type cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, of course, right now is, I mean, if you throw financing in, everybody would tell you it takes a long time. Brightmark Energy is a good example, the facility that I showed you there. I was at their groundbreaking back in May of last year, and you can see the project. They just if you follow them on Twitter, they're putting out an announcement already that they're looking to hire. So they're hoping to be operational, at least in commissioning, by Q4 of this year. So what would that be, about 18 months or so, and then fully operational in the first quarter of January 2021.
But in terms of just the state permitting process within that state to be an operational, is it a 3 to 4 year start to finish process?
I guess it depends on the speed of the state, right? I mean, maybe Texas is going to be a little bit quicker than some. So to be honest with you, I'd have to ask that question. I'm not sure.
Fair enough. Just an idea, just in terms of, as Senator Sosnowski knows, we'll hear a lot of words about megawatts and power production. In terms of the energy needed at the facility to carry out the operation, do you have an idea of how much power is needed in terms of from the utility to carry out the operations? In terms of, is it a 10 megawatt generation needed for a facility? Is it 5 megawatts of power?
I don't know. I mean, I know that, so the facilities mainly run on natural gas, right? So gas. And so I think, again, if you're thinking about pyrolysis, and again, that's a critical finding in this Argonne National Lab study, is so they need a little bit of process energy, a little bit of natural gas to get started. But then because the plastics 100% doesn't get converted to a liquid hydrocarbon, about 10% stays as a non-condensable gas, like a propane. And then they use that as the process energy. Now, we did, just to kind of talk about another study we did. Where is it? Sorry, this one. This looked at the emissions of these facilities versus very common hospitals, universities, food manufacturing. And again, because the only real emissions, again, are this combustion of the natural gas for the process energy, and then forklifts and things like that kind of driving around at the facility, they're very low compared to things, again, like hospitals, universities, food manufacturing, et cetera. So.
Okay. And then similar to maybe something that Terry and Senator Sosnowski was asking, in terms of, as you potentially embark on a project, in terms of there's a lot of financing and capital that requires, but also the permitting at the local level. Do you need supplier agreements with suppliers for this facility before you embark on all the state permitting process, or are you do they generally move in parallel tracks? What's the sequence of events generally?
I can't speak for every company, but generally they'd move at parallel tracks. I mean, again, and it's, you're not going to sort of downplay any of the challenges here. So that is one of the big challenges, right? Is yes, we generate a good amount of plastics, and a lot of that's going to landfill, unfortunately, but it's not all generated in one place. So lining up those feedstock agreements are critical. That Brightmark facility is going to be sourcing all around the Midwest, so Indiana, Illinois, Southern Michigan, et cetera. So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Craig, for this for the presentation here. Just a couple questions. Back to the feedstock. So you mentioned this hefty collection process, right? The curbside process and the R-Flex, maybe more of the output side of that, right? The MRF production. Are they doing that today in the country? Do they have these programs running to collect this material on the curb? And are there MRFs producing that R-Flex product for your facility? Do you know?
Right now, the R-Flex, so yes, so the MRF is JP Mascaro in Pennsylvania. Is it Yardsboro, Pennsylvania? I can find the exact town for you, but it's JP Mascaro is the name of the MRF in Pennsylvania. They have been testing this for a while, and so the next stage is to roll it out fully to the community. What they're using with the R-Flex bale now is for kind of a building material. You probably know them. Continuous Materials is one of the potential sort of offtake to produce kind of, they bought Rewall, and they're making boards and roofing boards. But certainly, yeah, the end markets is one of the more challenges. The Hefty Energy Bag is in 3 communities right now. So that's, 4 actually if you count Lincoln. So it's Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska, Boise, Idaho, and Cobb County, Georgia. So yes, we're definitely at the early parts of this. I mean, we do definitely have to scale that. We'll make no bones about that.
Yeah, and I would suspect that the percentage of feedstock coming from those sources would be small in comparison to the total feedstock, right? Well,
yeah, it would be smaller, yeah, percentage-wise. I mean,
negligible.
if you go to, again, sort of, I think Nexus is a great example.
Yeah.
The amount of material that's generated, oftentimes behind the scenes, again, at shopping malls and, through shipping, Walmarts, et cetera,
Yeah.
it's a lot of material. So that's important.
Yeah.
But you need, the key thing is these work together, and that the more homogeneous streams of sort of industrial kind of commercial materials help you process the more heterogeneous stuff that's coming from the residential consumer.
And do you know, and you may not, so if you don't know, we may have some of this information, how much of that abandoned product that goes into the waste stream today as a percentage of waste stream, do you know what those numbers are by chance?
Not off the top of my head, but I could probably get it for you.
That's fair, yeah. Okay, thank you.
I do know that we have very low recycling rates of this. I mean, most of the
we
recycling of
don't
plastics, as you know, is bottles.
That's
We have our plastics packaging recycling rate right now in the U.S. is only about 13%. So we have a long way to go to meet that 2040 goal.
Yeah, fair. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Terry Gray?
Okay, so I can't let you leave the table without asking this. So the core of the legislation last year had to do with exempting these facilities from solid waste permitting, and you mentioned that in your presentation. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on why that particular permit is such a barrier to development of these facilities. I mean, nobody likes to apply for permits,
Right.
But that one in particular kind of stands out as being a major issue. So if you could explain that, I would appreciate it.
So, this discussion actually started many years ago with, as I mentioned, we have these group of companies called, that are at ACC, called the Chemical Recycling Alliance. And one of the challenges that they had was, they were saying, and this is in the earlier days of sort of going to states, and they say, one of the challenges we have is, RCRA was passed in 1976. A lot of the state legislation passed years later. And so when we go to a state, they don't really have a defined regulatory pathway for us. And we're not solid waste, we're manufacturing, right? So but we get caught between these two worlds where they try to string stuff together and they think we're receiving waste, but we're not. Some groups are saying we're incineration because we're producing, a liquid fuel, and we're not. So it really is about sort of having that surety of, that transparent, unambiguous pathway for regulation, to avoid, of course, any sort of, as you're out sort of trying to get financing, as you're trying to get line up your feedstock agreements, your offtake agreements, that you don't have somebody coming at you saying, well, they're moving down the manufacturing pathway, but let's put a stop to this because they're actually an incinerator when they're not. So that's a critical part, especially for these early commercial technologies. I would say again, the other part is just from, again, when you think of it from the state's vantage point, is again, the activities that these facilities are involved in is not solid waste, right? I mean, they're not receiving paper and metal and glass and aluminum and trying to separate it and turn it into bales, and you're not worried about, bugs and rats and things like that and other vectors. What you should be worried about is, and thinking about is, okay, I want to make sure these facilities have an air permit, right? So that, they are combusting a little bit of a gas to get that process energy. They are storing crude oil or naphtha or wax on site. So we want to make sure that so it's important for these facilities, that's why, is to be appropriately regulated so they have that transparency, know what they're getting into. But secondly, it's important for the state because that makes you regulate them as what they are and not what they are not.
I think I would agree with you if the feedstock was clean and pure. And the more that it deviates from that, then the more the traditional solid waste issues may come up. So for instance, if you're pulling that material out of the solid waste stream, it's going to raise a lot of issues, I think, from DEM's perspective.
Well, so number one, if they're receiving solid waste, then you could easily regulate them. There's nothing that's exempt, right? So there's nothing in the bill that says that they're receiving solid waste, right? I mean, so the definition of post-use polymers ensures that this material is not commingled with solid waste or municipal solid waste or anything. So it gives the state that enforcement opportunity. And again, they don't want sort of material that's why the programs like the Materials Recovery for the Future or the Hefty Energy Bag, or taking sort of residue that's produced at Resource Recycling here, that's plastic, that's some film residue and pouches that people mistakenly throw in. That's why that's good material, right? Because it's a yield game at the end of the day. So these facilities don't want stuff that there's a spec they have to meet on. If BP or Shell, they're not putting in anything into their billion-dollar facilities, right? So they want stuff so the cleaner, purer that these facilities get is better because they have to meet that spec downstream.
Senator Sosnowski.
Thank you. I was going to ask about the electricity part of it, but Chris jumped on it. That's great. I'm concerned about the emissions issue and or issues.
Yep.
And also the pollutants that you spoke a little bit about the different pollutants and so forth, and I get a lot concerned about groundwater contamination as well.
Yep.
But I guess the biggest, not the most important, but the first question is about the emissions, and I'm curious about if there's been any testing done at the plants that are running now. What is the air quality? Does it differentiate what is being processed? And then if is there an ash, if you will, an ash product that's done with this, or is everything burnt up or cooked down to a fuel?
Yeah, so let me answer that first, and I'll get back to the emissions. So,
Okay.
So again, for pyrolysis, it's about a 80-10-10 process, right? So again, this is give or take a few. So if you have 100 pounds of plastics in, 75 to 80% of that is going to turn into a liquid that you can sell. 10% of that is going to be a char. It's almost like a carbon black. It's like a powder, and they are trying to find sort of uses for it. Can it go into tires, rubber, used as a carbon black? Otherwise, it can be safely landfilled. And then the other 10% are these non-condensable gases, right? So they don't condense back down to a liquid at room temperature, so like a propane. And so they use that as a process energy. And so the emissions from these facilities are really just, again, the combustion of a little bit of natural gas to get the process started, and then the combustion of these non-condensable gases to produce the, the process energy. And so again, we did a whole study on that. So this would be some good bedtime reading that looks at, and what this does is it looks at, there's something called hazardous air pollutants and criteria air pollutants. And this talks about that these facilities are producing less than things like, because a university, right? Think about Providence, right? They need a lot of energy and for hot showers and for electricity and the heat in the winter, right? So the boilers that they have there, hospitals, same thing, food manufacturing. So that's what this report looks at, and kind of looks at these kind of criteria air pollutant by criteria air pollutants, and shows that on balance, these facilities have lower emissions than those things.
Okay. And is that report done by the industry, or is that EPA or the state's environmental protection agency?
This was done by a company called Good Company, and they're based out of Eugene, Oregon. So they do work with private industry, but also with government as well.
Okay. So I guess I'm answering my own question. If we want to find out about the air quality in those states, we probably need to contact those individual states for their Department of Environmental Quality or whatever to find out what the testing results are.
Yeah, I mean, Agilix has been running for a long time in Oregon, so the Oregon DEQ is going to have all that data on them.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you,
welcome.
Mr. Chairman.
Same thing in Utah. Renewalogy would have the...
Because we are limited on time, I want to thank Craig very much for your presentation.
Great. Thank you for having me.
If you could possibly get us back the information that you said you would get over to Pat.
Sure.
And show she can contribute it to us.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I will. Thank you.